Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Thinking Space again today. Before we start, I just tell everybody that we are recording this seminar. So if you don't want to be recorded saying anything, don't say anything. Okay, thanks for that simple message. I like to keep it clear. So to start with, I acknowledge that the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which others of you may be located. Okay, we'll start immediately with the seminar. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. And I'll put the slides up to start with. That's the wrong one though, isn't it?
No, that's right.
Sorry? Can you fix it up and
yes.
speaker online?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Right. Thanks everyone for coming along. So today, Gareth and I are going to talk about a book project that we've been working on, in which we talk about what we're conceptualizing as 6 vantage points on climate finance. So in a speech to the 2019 Climate Action Summit at the UN General Assembly in New York, the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, now a UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance and a manager at one of the world's biggest, what's wrong?
I'm just trying to get your image up.
I think it's fine. Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't know why John is up there and not me. Anyway, okay. Conference at the UN, at the Workshop Action Summit at the UN, Mark Carney announced a new sustainable financial institution is currently being built. And for him, this would consist of comprehensive disclosure of climate-related financial risks by companies, new and improved forms of climate risk management for financial actors and institutions, and the mainstreaming of sustainable investment across the kind of financial ecosystems.
Just listening to
Okay, maybe folks on Zoom could, yep, that's it. Thanks, Linda. So a few months later, in January 22, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, took up Mark's comments in his widely read annual letter to CEOs. He wrote that he believed, quote, "We are on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance." So he was referring in this quote to the potential financial impacts of climate change on everything from municipal bonds to home mortgages to inflation rates. Fink stated that, quote, "Investors are recognizing that climate risk is investment risk." Prior to this announcement, activists had coordinated a sustained program of action, particularly targeted at BlackRock. And these groups included Extinction Rebellion to mainstream environmental NGOs like Friends of the Earth. And together they piled pressure onto BlackRock over the last few years. And they were compelling BlackRock to tackle climate change by, quote, "following the money." And so Bill McKibben, in an article in the New York Times, said that their work was trying to stop the money pipeline. And these activists highlighted the astonishing size of fossil fuel assets under management at BlackRock, almost $2 trillion in coal stocks alone. So these interventions kind of lay the scene for what we want to talk about in our book. And then they do so for 3 particular reasons. Firstly, they signal that climate finance is not a kind of standalone set of financial flows, but embedded in and reshaping the core institutions of capitalism in a way that encompasses but far exceeds climate-related development finance in particular. So these comments and actions also signal which kinds of climate finance are becoming dominant as climate change becomes increasingly central to capitalist finance. This vision of climate finance is one that privileges market-oriented climate action in a way that is heavily influenced by conventional economic thinking. And thirdly, while Carney and Fink represent a kind of dominant version of climate finance, Both of them, both have also been, climate finance has also been heavily contested by our activist environmentalist climate movements. And so in the book, following on from this, we take climate finance beyond the kind of sphere of development-related flows that it's typically been confined to, thinking more beyond debates about the size of climate finance flows necessary to finance a green transition, and whether or not these flows are kind of new and additional to other forms of investment. So rather than thinking of climate finance as a discrete, albeit major component of international climate politics, we want to bring climate finance into the realm of political economy. In doing this, we follow a real shift taking place in global capitalism, where climate change is becoming increasingly central to the operation of the financial system as a whole. And so we want to grapple then with both the opportunities and constraints that emerge by imagining and operationalizing climate futures through the lens of climate finance. Climate finance. These images are from the very popular, widely read, widely shared, widely cited reports on the global landscape of climate finance. Analyze the overall size and trends in climate-related investments over the last decade. So we can see the graph, well, I'll just put that down. We can see in this big blue graph that climate-related financial investments over the last decade have roughly doubled, from about 360 billion in 2012 to 640 billion in 2020. The graph shows that also shows that this falls well short of these projected needs for climate-related investment, which they estimate as being around $1.6 to $3.8 trillion in investment needed to stay below the 1.5 degree Celsius threshold. So this kind of thinking is what we call gap talk. It's the kind of gap between what is projected to be needed to transition for a sustainable transition to what is currently flowing. The bottom, these really amazing graphs also show the kinds of climate finance flow, so where it begins and where it ultimately ends up. And several trends here are notable. Public funding accounts for almost half of climate finance they report on. They also show divisions between mitigation and adaptation funding. I think their most recent report has adaptation funding at around 7% of total financial flows. And then we can see over here ultimately invested in water, transport, energy systems, and so on. So these kinds of reports tell us a great deal about climate finance, demonstrating trends over time, flows across space, different technologies and institutions, and so on. But it doesn't tell us very much about the kinds of futures, climate futures, ecological futures, economic futures, social futures that these investments might produce. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. For those that don't know me, I work over in political economy in the FAS faculty. So this question that Sophie kind of has opened up about the different kinds of, or how different kinds of climate finance are shaping different kinds of climate futures is the kind of central question that we're trying to answer in this book project. And so one of the first things we wanted to do was to go beyond that kind of gap talk and come up with a working definition for how we understand a broader conception of climate finance. So, and that's because despite all this gap talk, despite the kind of difficulties there's been here, you know, as we come up to the Egypt COP at the end of the year, problems of mobilizing that $100 billion of public climate finance, etc. That's created all sorts of resentment and inaction at the International Climate Forum level. But actually, when you look beyond that, there's quite a lot of climate finance flowing, mostly from private sources, but also with a lot of public backstopping as well. So on one level, we kind of have a position that in 2022, all finance is climate finance. And that's because basically all financial flows are going to have some implication for climate change. And so you can take something like, the mortgage you pay or the rent you pay as a financial flow. Clearly that has implications for climate change now. Is that mortgage product that you have linked to energy efficiency requirements or not, et cetera, et cetera. But we wanted to narrow it down a little bit to have a more workable definition of climate finance. And so this is what we've come up with. Our definition is climate finance is strategies that mobilize financial ideas, instruments, and institutions to reshape the relationship between capitalist economies and climate change. So this is a little bit broader than if you look up the kind of UN definition of what climate finance is, which is roughly financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. There's nothing really wrong with that, but we think climate finance is more than that in two key ways. So firstly, we're not just talking about the kind of climate solutions that are emanating from financial ideas or the finance sector. As Sophie covered, we're also interested in how climate change and the rise of climate change is reshaping how financial markets operate and how finance works in a kind of two-way relationship. And we're also interested in working across that kind of adaptation, mitigation divide, often treated as separate issues, but that's not necessarily satisfying when we're wanting to take a critical perspective on climate finance, because mitigation finance is happening in the context of a changing climate, of course, and any kind of adaptation finance implicitly or explicitly takes a position on the extent of mitigation that is going to occur. So yeah, more broadly, our book is premised on an approach to climate finance that views it not as a singular or neutral means towards reaching this end goal of a safer climate, which kind of comes across in that kind of UN definition, but rather a window into the political economy of different climate futures. So our argument or our conceptual framework is that climate finance is both an indicator as well as a mediator of the political economy of climate change. So what we mean by that is, first, climate finance is a product of politics and political contestation between different actors and institutions with very different interests, very different visions of climate change and climate policy. This means that different forms of climate finance and the relative significance of those different forms of climate finance are therefore indicators of the balance of political economic ideas and forces that are really opening up certain climate futures and closing other potential climate futures. Secondly, climate finance is now deeply entangled into the broader structural dynamics of capitalism and how capitalism, or potentially post-capitalism, is being reshaped or potentially transformed through the advent of climate change. So that means that the design, construction, and operation of climate finance is therefore a very powerful mediator in the co-production of climate futures. Last one more slide for me. So in the book, we had this idea, we structure the book in terms of these 6 main chapters on which we call 6 vantage points on climate finance. So by a vantage point, what we mean is the different ways that climate change is viewed through different lenses, from different perspectives, and how this shapes the different kinds of climate futures that might be produced through those different vantage points. So we don't understand these 6 vantage points as kind of mutually exclusive in the sense of the world will kind of go down one route or the other. We understand them as representing all of these different dynamics that are happening at once and in different combinations to create different possible futures. So I'm just going to go through the 6 quickly now, and then we're going to talk through hopefully 4 of them, or with some illustrations depending on how we go for time. So the first vantage point we call climate capital. So this attempts to see climate change as a business opportunity through, in particular, the creation of new climate-linked asset classes. So in this chapter, we explore things like the rise of sustainable and responsible investment funds, green bond markets, resilience infrastructure, and renewable energy asset financing. The second is climate risk, which in contrast to climate capital attempts to manage rather than looking for the upside of climate change in terms of business opportunities, attempts to manage the potential downsides of climate change as a financial risk. So in this chapter, we look at climate-related financial risk disclosures and the movement towards that. We look at ESG, environmental, social and governance integration, and we look at the fossil fuel divestment movement as an example of a movement that's actively engaging in the politics of climate risk. The third vantage point is what we're calling precision markets. So precision markets are attempts to do climate finance that are about trying to find the most economically optimal or efficient response to climate change. So in a really precise way, weighing up the costs and benefits and looking for the optimal decision to ensure that you don't do too little climate action, but you also don't do too much climate action. So here we're talking about debates around the social cost of carbon, carbon pricing schemes like carbon markets, carbon offsetting, as well as insurance markets and how they're dealing with climate change. The fourth we call speculative markets. So we contrast this with precision markets, which are looking for kind of optimizing and gradual adjustments. With speculative markets, we're talking about approaches to climate finance that take really big bets on future technological and financial breakthroughs in the climate space. So in this chapter, we cover the domain of green billionaires, people like Tesla's Elon Musk, speculative proposals for climate engineering, as well as off-grid solar frontiers in developing countries, which kind of take relatively mundane technologies but are looking for financial speculative opportunities to expand those markets. The fifth vantage point is what we're calling big green states. So we're careful to emphasize that across all of our vantage points, the state plays certain roles. But in big green states, we're interested in how governments might be able to or are playing more active roles in using public finance to shape climate futures. So in this chapter, we look at international green climate funds, the debates around the greening of central banking, and green public investment, green industrial policy, green debates about that as well. And the final one, the sixth vantage point, we're calling climate justice. So here we're looking at attempts to understand climate finance with concerns about inequality, democratic participation, justice issues in general. And we're looking at this at different scales. So from national plans for national proposals for Green New Deal programs, localized degrowth strategies, as well as global demands for climate reparations for historical climate debts. So over to Sophie. I might just ask somebody online, I think is, there's a bit of noise coming through. So if everyone can make sure they're muted.
Turn yourself on mute, Beck. No shame in calling that. Okay, I'm going to talk about our first book chapter, Climate Capital. This is the kind of quintessential vision of how to manage climate change through financial markets. Well, actually, I suppose climate capital and climate risk. Let me just see if this. Oh, it's okay, Beck. Forgive me. Thanks, mate. Okay, so our first vantage point is climate capital. In this configuration, climate change is understood not as a threat to financial markets, but as an opportunity for financial growth and expansion. And so climate finance is successful as climate capital when it creates profitable investment opportunities by creating these new climate-linked asset classes. So an asset is a property that can be owned, controlled, and usually traded. Assets produce future income streams that the owner has rights to, and assets store value, which are usually calculated based on expectations of future income. So assets can be stored on different kinds of people's balance sheets, if you own your house, that's an asset on your household balance sheet. So we think of climate capital as strategies that kind of turn climate change action into financial assets. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about green bonds as one example of this. So green bonds operate very similarly to vanilla bonds or just regular bonds as mechanisms for public or private actors to borrow money. So that is the bond originator, the person who's borrowing the money. The borrower would issue a bond, then sell it to an investor who is effectively loaning money to that bond borrower in return for regular interest payments and the repayment of the bond principal at maturity. So that's that process up the top. So green bonds are structured in the same way. They have absolutely no different bond structure, but their capital is intended or tagged for projects with a self-proclaimed environmental or climate credential. So a key contention of green bond markets then is how to assure the green outcomes of these projects. So there's no greenness structured into the financial deal itself. So critical research about green bonds has showed some, like a lot of the limits and kind of perverse outcomes of this tool. For a bunch of complex and geographical reasons, large swathes of the most vulnerable parts of the world are able to access this financial mechanism. There's a kind of assumption that $250 million is the kind of basic amount for issuing a green bond. And most, or for instance, small island developing states have no capacity to offer a $250 million bond to finance green investments. Other research has shown that they produce much greater value for investors rather than for borrowers or publics who are intended to benefit from these bonds. And finally, there are ongoing questions, as I mentioned, about whether or not they actually deliver green outcomes. And so there's a phenomenon in the literature called green default, where the bonds deliver on their financial expectations, but not in terms of the green promises that they made at the outset. So while climate capital then creates these bankable asset classes, an asset and financial arrangement that guarantees future incomes and green outcomes, green bonds and the other examples that we demonstrate in this chapter produce vague or undefined climate chaos. So they look good for producing financial outcomes, but there's little evidence that the market is working to fulfill the climate finance gap to support climate transitions. And they also produce pretty negative social distributional outcomes as well. Yes, okay.
Cool. Thanks, Sophie. Okay, we're going to skip over chapters 2 and 3 because we just don't have time to go through everything. And we're going to go to chapter 4 on speculative markets. So if what Sophie was talking about in terms of climate capital is really about kind of taking existing financial mechanisms, so bond is a classic example there, and looking at how they can be greened. Speculative markets, I think we can contrast how we're thinking about them by looking at attempts to basically use climate change as an opportunity to disrupt the economy in certain ways through technological and financial breakthroughs. However, we need to contrast that with the kind of irony of a lot of these kind of interventions we're talking about in the speculative space, which do a pretty good job of maintaining the status quo a lot of the time in terms of underlying drivers of climate change. So what we call speculative markets refers to actors, as I said before, taking these big bets on the future of climate change through speculative and spectacular often interventions. So I know that I think it was the last thinking space was looking at climate fiction. So what we're talking about here is often the sort of stuff you might look at in a Kim Stanley Robinson novel, which I think Kurt might have talked to you about. Indeed, like in his Ministry for the Future novel, speculative geoengineering technologies play a kind of central role. These technologies are no longer simply limited to the imaginations of sci-fi authors. They're being made a reality today, including quite a bit of work being done here at University of Sydney. So geoengineering, or what we call it climate engineering, refers to intentional large-scale intervention in the Earth's climate system to counter climate change. This term commonly encompasses two broad types of technological practices. So one is carbon removal technologies, such as direct air capture, which work to suck carbon from the air, which can then either be utilised or stored underground in an attempt to draw down emissions, historical emissions that are already in the atmosphere. And secondly, solar radiation management, so things like stratospheric aerosol injections of particles into the atmosphere in an attempt to lessen the effects of global warming by dispersing and reflecting sunlight. So needless to say, these are super controversial technologies. Critics argue that climate engineering provides an excuse for climate inaction on the basis of quite risky and unproven technologies. And while solar radiation management indeed remains very controversial and unproven, we are seeing more interest emerging in direct air capture technologies, which are being propelled by research showing the need for negative emissions to be able to meet climate goals, given how much emissions are already being put in the atmosphere historically. So direct air capture is a perfect example, I think, of how financing plays a crucial role in determining whether it's a technology of climate delay, which delays action, or whether it can be direct air capture can be a technology that complements decarbonisation. So right now, as is the case with lots of this speculative stuff, it's very much in the demonstration phase. And what we're seeing is big tech companies like the online payments company Stripe paying really high above market offset rates to buy offsets from direct air capture. So $1,000 a tonne when you can actually go and spend a few dollars a tonne on another type of offset, because they want to be seen as the first movers. So this is what's financing the Swiss company Climeworks. You might have seen some of the media around it over the last year or so. They opened the first semi-commercial direct air capture plant in Iceland this year. That's the plant up there in the top right-hand image there. But as we kind of go from that kind of demonstration phase potentially to a more scale up of direct air capture for carbon removals, so rather than removing sort of in the thousands of tonnes, in the billions of tonnes, which is what the kind of promise of negative emissions technologies is, as a society we'll face a political choice about what to do with these technologies, which manifest in a lot of ways in the first instance as a financing choice. So there's a choice one, I think, in simple terms, would be to allow fossil fuel companies to finance direct air capture by purchasing carbon credits to offset continuing emissions. If it works, that's at best carbon neutral, not carbon negative, and can delay other investments in the energy transition. We are seeing these models emerging. So the bottom right-hand image here I just took from Canadian company Carbon Engineering, another DAX startup, which is being heavily financed by Chevron and Occidental Petroleum, among others. Choice two is a different kind of financing route, which would be to think about public sources of finance for direct air capture, which potentially have the opportunity, or there's potentially a prospect there to treat direct air capture or carbon removal in a similar way to like a public sewage system for the skies, which can potentially be governed in a quite different way and might have the potential to get genuine carbon negativity.
We have time.
We have time? Okay, cool. We weren't sure if we're going to get through our last two. So we're going to do two more chapters, Big Green States, and then Sophie's going to come in climate justice. These are actually the two chapters we're only starting to write now. So whereas the other ones are all written. Okay, I'm going to go Big Green States first. So as I said, all of the vantage points we've looked at have roles for the states, but usually this is a regulatory role or a kind of de-risking and subsidizing role of private markets. So what we really want to bring out in this chapter on what we call Big Green States is forms of climate finance that are oriented towards more direct and potentially more kind of activist role of the state in using public finance for public investment. As with our other vantage points, this is contested. There's different possibilities at play here. And this contestation, we look at the way it's occurring at what August et al. In a recent Progress in Human Geography article called the dynamic interface of public and private finance, which is a really useful piece. So on the one hand, when you look at a lot of public finance, it really shows a real narrowing of possibilities and diminished capacities for state action, where states are putting public finance in, but only really at best to mimic market-based solutions. On the other hand, we can see a more expansive domain of public finance, which contains all sorts of possibilities, spanning from what we might call a green Keynesian kind of macroeconomic management approach through to more deep democratically planning, potentially non-market solutions. So just to illustrate, as we've done with the others, state investment banks provide a good example of this spectrum. So the dominant kind of state investment bank that we see views its role in a very limited way as kind of the state can only step in where there's a need to correct market failures, and the state can kind of provide some sort of seed capital to leverage what is still a private investment-driven solution. And so the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in Australia is a good example of that. An emerging alternative kind of the Keynesian kind of variety, being pushed by Mariano Mazzucato, the British-Italian economist, is state investment banks that have what she calls a mission-based orientation. So this approach to state investment banks continues to work with the private sector, but kind of tries to flip that relationship around, where social and environmental goals set by the state, not kind of market gaps, provides the impetus for public investment. And so the newish Scottish National Investment Bank is often put forward as an example of this kind of mission-based approach. Finally, we see, and these are kind of more proposals rather than actually existing institutions, there's lots of good proposals out there for much more public versions of state investment banks that really aim to mobilize the fiscal and monetary powers of the state to develop rapid and widespread public investment in publicly owned climate infrastructure, whether it's energy, transport, buildings, and more. So an example here is you look at the Green New Deal for Europe manifesto proposal, where they have a proposal to kind of retool the existing European Investment Bank to finance what they call a Green Public Works program.
So I think we really wanted to avoid the kind of 5 bad chapters and 1 good chapter orientation of the book. And so actually one of the key goals throughout the book is to kind of emphasize the way that all of these vantage points actually offer points for contestation and are being used by different kinds of political movements to achieve different kinds of outcomes, even with those kind of more mainstream climate finance tools. That being said, in the final chapter, we did want to think about climate finance from the vantage point of climate justice, particularly in the way that it thinks of climate change in the context of other inequalities, marginalizations that have been produced in the kind of longue durée of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and other forms of structural violence, and also constraints on democracy. And so these visions for climate finance then think about justice in terms of working towards freedoms, liberation, and democracy. And so in this chapter, yet to be written, we're working through a variety of cases that work across scales, but that make justice claims on climate finance by connecting climate change to these other vulnerabilities. So at the most encompassing, this includes more radical proposals for Green New Deal, that are using the financial and regulatory power of the state to meet the imperatives of a low carbon transition, while securing all sorts of other economic and social goals, such as green collar jobs, climate friendly housing, sustainable public transport, and in Australia, of course, working towards Indigenous self-determination and freedoms. And so the red deal, you can't quite see the top of that, that's called the red deal, is an Indigenous-led Green New Deal program. Other examples are working more locally. And so we're also looking at the example of renewable energy cooperatives. We talked a little bit about cooperative power yesterday, Gareth, and in other presentations. But these are cooperatives that aim to transform or democratize climate finance through a one member, one vote, rather than a $1, one vote structure of capitalist enterprise. So cooperative power, of which you could all be a member if you wanted to, is one example of this. This is an Australian union-owned electricity retailer, owned by a variety of unions, including the NTEU. And so as a member of the NTEU, you would be entitled to be a member of cooperative power. That is attempting to collectivize power purchase agreements, making them more affordable for workers, and pursuing green energy at the same time, while appropriating the surplus from these power purchasing agreements to support a variety of green and red actions that members decide on collectively. So they have a series of proposals that are voted on by members. For instance, supporting Indigenous-owned renewable energy generation, or during the early stages of COVID, they subsidised the energy bills of various precariously paid workers. The final example that we're working with is climate reparations, and this is acting at a kind of global scale. So climate reparations builds on movements for reparations from slavery, but in this case is making demands for both financial and more than financial transfers of wealth from rich polluting countries to vulnerable countries. So this transfer of resources then offers to redress the most basic and widest of inequalities at the heart of climate change, that those feeling its effects most acutely did so little to cause the problem. So some proposals for this call for a debt cancellation to achieve these reparations, but all of them move beyond this to call for radically scaled up, few strings attached grants for climate resilient development for the most vulnerable. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, we have about 20 minutes or 15 minutes for questions. So we can have questions from the Zoom audience or from the people in the room. Anyone in the room, we don't have a lapel mic, so maybe if you come up here. If you just ask a question, we can repeat it. So people, I think that's probably as long as it's a short one. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so any questions or comments? I'll start with Yuni.
I'm very worried about contracted ideas of climate future are faced by the way the financial and finance is made up. So yeah, when I listened to your presentation about the 5 vantage points which you framed, it seems that they have similarities in a way that it seems that the developed countries and states have advantage of so the characteristic of this vantage point seems to favoring the developed countries. For example, in climate capital, it requires financial capacity. In speculative markets, it requires technological capacity. In different states, it requires capacity of state and private capital and so on. So the field framework addresses the uneven development that seems to be exacerbated by the effect of climate change. Thank you.
So the question for those at home is about whether or not these climate finance institutions or climate finance vantage points kind of take into account the financial systems in developing economies rather than just in developed economies rather than also in developing economies. So I think actually, I mean, that might be a critique of what we've set up in terms of what you have perceived from what we've said. I think that's potentially the case. But all of the examples that we're talking about, we're really explicitly trying to look across different kinds of contexts. And so one of the things about climate finance is politically, it's been mobilized as an issue for developing countries, right? This is a kind of large-scale justice question about transfers from rich countries to poor countries. And that's how it's set up in international politics. What we're trying to do is actually say that is only a really narrow understanding of what climate finance is producing in terms of climate futures, while being a kind of really important distributional claim and political claim. So all of the examples all of the chapters that we look at do really explicitly think about kind of advanced economies and developing economies. One of the examples in the speculative, a good example of that, I think, in the speculative markets chapter is looking at off-grid solar as a kind of climate finance relation that's being produced really widely across uneven or productive of uneven development. And so these are companies that are largely owned by venture capitalists in trying to electrify rural and remote communities throughout the developing, mostly in East and West Africa, actually, but in really poor communities. But that it's a kind of financial frontier. They're hoping to a financial frontier of inclusion, a financial inclusion, right? So constantly trying to make poor people pay for electricity in a way that they actually can't. And continually trying to innovate in order to financially and technologically, in order to make poor people pay for electricity that they can't actually afford. So I think, yeah, maybe the examples we've chosen didn't really illustrate how we're trying to think about these vantage points really across a diverse section of scenarios. But yeah, I take your question. I think that's a really good one. Did you want to add anything?
I just think that's a really good articulation. Like maybe we can borrow it a little bit. Because yeah, you're right that across all of them there's massive inequality. So like I guess we're trying to represent what we think is like the terrain of what's going on. And basically across all of them, they're totally infused with those inequalities in capacity and capital and all that sort of stuff. So that's like a kind of, my reaction to what you said is that's a really good way of articulating like a kind of reality of the way that this is playing out. So I think that's a nice thing we could maybe, like reflect on, especially in the conclusion, to sort of draw out those global inequalities that sit throughout all of them, including like the more progressive options. And we're kind of, I think the other thing just to quickly add is that we see an openness, political openness in all of them, but not to the same extent. Like, some of them have a relatively narrow range of like better or worse possibility, and some of them have a much broader range of better or worse possibility.
Okay, I think June and Neil had a question. Is that right? And also we have one from Archana on online. So maybe could do that one first.
Yeah. So
and then June. Then
I think the book is about the impact of climate finance. That's the entire topic of the whole book. Are we going to produce a thing in terms of whether climate finance produces reductions in greenhouse gas emissions? No, that's not what we're doing. And I think that's not the kind of technical exercise that we're interested in the book. There are all sorts of other folks, including, as we constantly are reminded by SEI, Tanya Fiedler and Alistair Fraser are doing a project about this in the business school and in economics. That's their project. Our project is trying to think about the political economies of climate finance in a kind of conceptual sense. All of them show, like, as part of this assessment is definitely to examine whether or not they are actually effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And invariably, yes and no to different extents. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Okay. June?
Thank you so much, Sophie and Gareth. Because with my work with the ICCA, which is Indigenous and local Indigenous and local communities consortium, we're starting to think about financing on a global, on a global scale, like working with all the different instruments. So for example, like climate and also conservation financing for indigenous and local communities around the world, especially in developing countries. So when you talk about speculative markets, I wrote down climate markets on steroids, because I mean, just sort of boggles my mind that we're taking it for granted and calling climate engineering mainstream. And then you have a section about climate justice, people are talking about different types of markets like degrowth and such, and that's seen as radical. It's like, I mean, it's a question of comment. I just feel it's more of a comment, and I feel like it's a bit frustrated. So people are talking about speculative features or speculative markets, but because it doesn't come with like the massive like influence in capital, it's not necessarily like mutually extractive, it's trying to rethink how we, like we use waste and such. It's seen as more radical, it's not seen as more mainstream. I mean, for me, it's quite frustrating. The thing used for you that you can comment in the speculative markets. I would think that people are there giving out ideas as well. The economy, and why is that radical engineering?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice, like a really good observation. And yeah, it's totally reflective of, like you say, where the proposals are coming from, where the money's coming from, who's backing it, and how embedded they are in kind of, the kind of financial institutions, etc., versus from the outside. So yeah, I think we could maybe also follow that and think that out kind of critical conclusion as well.
Yeah, I think it's important though to distinguish between like the financial flows, which are mundane for the speculative. I don't think our speculative chapter, I think we think that these things are wild, like completely wild. And that's what makes them speculative, because they have these kind of fanciful imaginaries about the future. So I don't think I think we're quite explicit about that in the speculative.
Investors, like the markets.
But the investors are,
yeah.
Well, I mean, do you think that Elon Musk thinks that he's mainstream? I think Elon Musk thinks that he's wild. That's part of his projection, right? Like, yeah. And so I think that's what we're really trying to get at in that title. But I think it's absolutely right in terms of trying to dig out what is mainstream and what is radical across these different kinds of domains. I think that's a good prompt. I will just say too that I think you're kind of pointing to the climate justice chapter a little bit as well. And I think we're trying to frame that in, not to say that this is like the radical, hopeful solutions. This is just a different way of thinking about climate finance, and different kinds of social movements and forces have the ability to contest across all of those. And I think that's, what you're saying about Indigenous groups trying to make claims on climate finance, that actually exists within mainstream climate finance frameworks, right? It's just directing to different kinds of goals and ends. And Gareth was at a thing we did yesterday where we're trying to think about the way that climate finance creates actually opportunities for radically different kinds of futures, because they create financial claims and claims against financial institutions and states and so on in these really interesting and contested ways. So yeah, thanks.
I think Neil was next. Are there any other questions? Joe and then Phil. We'll have to move through them fairly quickly.
Okay, thanks for the talk. Could you say a bit more about what the vantage point is?
Yeah.
And what it does for you, types, domains, kinds, those kind of words were in there as well. But we can come across these in the past, these are different programs, different active configurations, balance public and private, scales, different timelines, different ultimate goals and targets. So yeah, just circle back around. So vantage point, what is that? And
yeah.
Why is that separated into?
Yeah. So just for those online, Neil is asking us why we chose the idea of vantage point. So it was really explicitly made to us by our editor. I'll just say quickly, Brett Christophers, that this was not to be an assemblage. And so that was the kind of starting point.
I think we had orientation.
We had orientations actually, and he didn't like that. But Gareth can talk about anyway, Gareth can talk about that.
Yeah, we need, I mean, it's actually something, it's good that you brought it up because it's actually, you know, in terms of the writing process, we did this work in the introduction, which is anyway, we wrote this stuff like last year sometime.
Or even in 2020.
Yeah,
potentially.
you know, before we.
There's several kids since then.
So, yeah, so that's something that we need to like tighten up, I think. So it's good that you raised it. So I think our thinking in terms of vantage point is there's sort of two levels of it. Like one is like a kind of, and I actually kind of borrowed a little bit from Bertel Ullman's work on dialectics, is where I sort of kind of, where I kind of, you know, started to think through the idea a bit more. So a vantage point has been like partly like a way of seeing the world, and that applies to both kind of the actual processes and actors that they're talking about, but also to kind of us as researchers who are writing about how others are seeing the world and sort of trying to shape the world in their own image. But also trying to kind of capture a more materialist kind of anchor within that, where actually people do operate with certain positions in financial markets, in politics, in their role as you know, in social movements, whatever it might be. So that's what and so that kind of vantage point is kind of, you know, anchored in that sense too. So it's not just like there's different lenses of seeing the world in a really pluralist sense, of like they're all equally kind of potentially valid. It's more like, you know, they're actually shaped by real dynamics. So that's what we're trying to capture with it. But I actually do think we do need to fine tune it some more, rethink it a little bit more as we actually finalize the writing.
Basis for comparison or separation.
Yeah, it's good feedback.
Okay, Joe is next.
Climate litigation is vital, changing climate financing, particularly I think in the generation, and the trade litigation is for the rest of the generation and climate financing. And I'm thinking, oh, which vantage point we didn't quite go on that? And that's exactly I think like the point that Neil was saying. Actually, yeah, that's kind of litigation is vital for climate finance. Where does it fit?
Yeah, good question. We've actually talked about this a little bit, and part of it's just, you know, we're not like some of the boundaries are totally porous, and like so that's something maybe we need to sort of think about. But it kind of sits between, like, there's one way of thinking about it, which is it's the politics of climate risk, which is like, I think a really interesting politics because it's sort of saying, you know, the way that investors are thinking about climate change is through this prism of climate risk. But climate risk is not objective. Like, that's actually inherent in the idea of transition risk, which is actually all about what investors think is going to happen politically with climate policy and how they're going to respond to that, which they're far more worried about than like sea level rise. So I think that is an example of the politics of climate risk, where you're actually not just saying, so they talk objectively like this is a climate risk you need to take into account, but the process of saying that is actually what is creating the climate risk, is actually making it something that otherwise may not have been risky, because, you know, there's a threat of legal judgment or follow-on kind of policy legislation or whatever. So that's how I understand it. But there's also a justice angle to it. There's clearly illegal, like you're operating through the courts and that sort of stuff. So it sort of fits between both.
That's the way. Why getting the narrative around the
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we should probably try and think about some more examples of how things cut across. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question, Phil.
Right, thank you for the presentation. Right, my question is on Sophie's point that you want to have 5 bad and 1 good vantage point. So what are your preliminary conclusions, where you get to in terms of where you go with the stuff?
We haven't written the conclusion yet.
But I'm pushing you on it, so
Gareth is like, hey, we've got 2 more chapters to write, chapter 5 and chapter 6. And I'm like, mate, what about that conclusion? He's like, no, fine. And I'm like, what are we going to say? I literally don't know at all. What are you going to write in the conclusion, Gareth? I'm in charge of.
Yeah, I think I don't know if we're going, I'm not sure where we'll end up landing. Like, the kind of, in one way, it's like a map of like how we see things, like the way, way things are going, which hopefully is useful for being able to untangle like and make strategic decisions and that sort of thing, wherever, if you're interested in like, say, not completely, uninhabitable planet and all that kind of stuff. So like that's a kind of removed kind of conclusion. In terms of like, where we might take like a position on, what we see as the kind of more promising areas of climate finance. Like, I think across all of the chapters we've written, we do that. So like, my position on climate engineering, for example, is that ultimately it has to be a public financing option if it's going to go ahead. So we do take like all sorts of like arguments like that, but in terms of how we bring it together.
So something we, I guess, have been working on in some other work and where we hope to go next with this is that the kind of current state of climate finance offers these opportunities for engagement that shouldn't be written off because the climate situation is dire enough that we have to engage with all of them. And the way we've been thinking about this in other work is trying to think about repair and reparations as these kind of opportunities for repairing existing climate financial entanglements and the kinds of climate futures they might produce, as well as thinking about redistribution across space and time of wealth that has been accumulated through climate change, and as the kind of guiding stars of how we might engage with climate finance. So that's kind of where we're going.
Thank you. And it is, I think, a strategic, like it is like a strategic orientation to seeing possibilities for like types of, different versions of climate finance as they exist to be reworked, repurposed, contested, and like, so that, that's definitely where we're coming from, as a kind of, like without trying to do it, orientation, like strategic orientation to climate finance as it exists.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Gareth and Sophie. And thanks to everyone for coming, both online and in person. The next session will be in 2 weeks' time. It will start at 12:30 and go to 2 o'clock. So we have 3 presentations. So that'll be in the program that advise you of that. Okay, thank you very much.